because that's kind of what grief feels like, is you're down in this hole and there's no rope and there's no ladder and you're in it alone and it's dark and dirty and scary. And the people who are the most important in life are the people who come down into it with you, not the people who try to pull you out before you're ready. When we were at camp and we did the balloon release service, and I walked out into the field by myself and I released a balloon for my dad. And I hadn't gotten to do that knowing what I know now at 8. And so it was so nice to get to come back and let go of another balloon for him, knowing the full truth of what happened and having spent 12 years grieving the loss of him. It was nice to get to do that again.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. My name is Angela Hamblin Kelly, and I'm the administrator of Baptist Centers for Good Grief. Today's episode is very special to me. We are joined by Kate, one of our former campers. I love nothing more than when we get to visit with a former camper. As an 8-year-old child, Kate had to navigate the uncertainties of grief. She's here today to talk about that journey from that 8-year-old child to the young adult she is today.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Well, Kate, I am just so grateful that you're here today and just so appreciate your willingness to share with people your experience as a former camper, a former client, now an intern. That's been incredible for us as the Baptist Centers for Good Grief staff to be able to see one of our own come back and be an intern and navigating through the mental health world, becoming a counselor, all those things. And I think that's just really great for us to be here together today and talk, because I think other families will be interested, parents will be interested in hearing from someone who's been there, who was the camper, who was the client, because so many of our families now, their number one concern, and you've heard this, will my child be okay? Yeah. So we're definitely going to get into that. But before we do, why don't you just introduce yourself to everyone and just a little bit about your family and your road to the Baptist Centers for Good Grief.
Yeah, of course. So, hi, y'all. Like she said, my name is Kate. I'm a rising senior at Baylor, and I'm a child and family studies major there. And I'm planning on getting a master's in clinical mental health counseling. I'd like to be a counselor because receiving counseling was so game-changing for me after I lost my dad. And then when I struggled with anxiety, having a therapist really is what set me up for success where I am today. And so I would just love to be able to do that for other people who've experienced something similar to what I went through when I was 8. So like she said, I was a client at the centers and I went to camp. I lost my dad when I was 8. It was right before Christmas time. And then we moved pretty soon after. So that was another difficult adjustment. And my grandmother knew people who were at the center through some of her friends who do charity work. And so she recommended to my mom that we receive counseling and that we check y'all out because we were all going through such a difficult time losing a really vital piece of our family. It was my mom, my dad, my brother, and I. There were 4 of us. And obviously him passing away completely changed everything for us. It changed our financial situation. It changed the way our family looked. Like, it was just kind of groundbreaking for us in honestly the worst way possible. And so having guidance from counselors when that happened really, I think, helped everyone to process that it had happened, because when he passed away, obviously it came as a shock to everyone. And having someone there to work through it with us was so great, because it made it feel a little bit more real and gave us a chance to talk through it when we might not have been able to talk about it with anyone else, because it was so difficult for everyone around us that nobody really had the space for each other's emotions. So being able to talk about them with a therapist was really game changer for us. And then my brother and I went to camp when I was 9, and I don't remember a lot from it. A lot from that time is really hazy for me, but I do remember how much I enjoyed the arts portion doing back in my day. It was 3-day camp, and we made kaleidoscopes and the dream catchers. And I know that dream catcher hung on my bed forever after camp. And it was just very impactful to get to be there and realize that I was not the only kid who had a dead parent, because at the time at my school, I was the only kid with a dead parent. And so meeting other kids who'd experienced something like that was really great for me. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's so meaningful to us as the staff when we get to see, kids that we've worked with grow up. And, I think we're somewhere around 50 to 60 former campers who've come back over the years in some capacity to volunteer. And that's just so meaningful. And having you back has been meaningful because you and I have been able to have some of these conversations with not Kate, the 8-year-old. And so today we will visit with Kate, the 8 and 9-year-old, but then also you today and how your grief still impacts you and shows up and stays with you, but then also the reflections of looking back. But I think as counselors, it's so meaningful to be able to hear and to know that this work does make a difference. Just that dream catcher you said right there. We hear that so much from people. And then you saw the kids this year do their dream catchers. Was that a moment for you in that?
It was, because I knew how much I valued taking that home with me, and just as kind of a reminder of what we learned about at camp, because you're young and you forget things pretty quickly. That's just the nature of being an 8-year-old. And so having a physical thing to take back from camp with me that sat right next to my head when I slept was just kind of a reminder of that. We talked about that it's okay for losing a parent to make it harder to sleep. That's normal, and it happens for a lot of people. And so I remember feeling really reassured that my behavior that seemed really out of the ordinary for an 8-year-old was okay and was in fact very normal, and that a lot of other 8-year-olds who'd lost parents had the exact same problems. And so it kind of reminded me of everything I had learned about at camp and at the center. And so I really enjoyed having that. And so it was really nice to get to see the kids at camp make them, because I'm sure that for some of them, that's going to be something that they have for a long time that reminds them of their camp experience.
Absolutely. We certainly hope so. And we have heard that over the years. You were talking about with the death of your father, how much it changed so many things. You said your financial status, you all moved, you kind of realizing there's nobody else at school who has a parent who's died. And I hear a lot of identity in that, like your self-identity change. Can you speak to that about even now as an adult, how you feel that, but also maybe the ways that's changed over the years for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So when my dad passed away, like we talked about before we started recording, I became a very precocious 8-year-old. And I think that prior to him dying, I was already I loved to read and I loved information, and I was pretty not into what all the other kids were doing. I wanted to, do my own thing. But when my dad passed away, it became more so, the joke was always, oh, you have such an old soul. You're a 40-year-old in an 8-year-old's body. And yes, I did prefer to hang out with all the moms of my friends. And I did not tend to be interested in a lot of the same things other 8-year-olds were interested in. And in a way, it was funny, like, haha. But there were also, it changed who I was because I became a worrier. And that is what, if you ask anyone close to me in my life, they would be like, Kate worries all the time. And it's gotten a lot better over the years. But when I was 8, the big shift for me was that I became so anxious as a child. And that really made me stand out from all the other kids in my grade because I was very withdrawn, and being at school was incredibly difficult. I went from somebody who loved going to school and I read all the books in the lower school library to finding it really hard to be there because all I could think about was, what if somebody else I know dies and I'm not there? And sitting at that desk just gave me so much time to like stew over everything that could possibly be happening in the outside world while I was at school. So I became a worrier, which had not really been at all how I was prior to the death. And I was given worry dolls and worry rocks and everything to try and help. And that just didn't help because I just felt like I was inconveniencing people by worrying because it seemed like it was bothersome to them that I was constantly asking, have you heard from my mom? Is my mom going to pick me up from school? Where's my mom? Is she okay? And the same questions about the other people in my life who would take care of me. And so that was a big change in who I was as a person because none of those had been questions that I had needed the answers to before. And then I also just became very strict with the rules. I liked time. I liked to know where people were and what was going on. Whereas beforehand as a kid, I'd kind of been like, I'll get picked up when I get picked up and I'll go wherever you take me because I'm 8 and you're my mom and I'm just going to do whatever you want. But it went from that to who's getting me after school? Where am I going after school? Who's going to get me from there? And I had to have the answers for everything. And I think that that has continued on into my adult life a little bit, but it's not something that cripples me. It's something that I can be a little bit better about where I'm not as worried about where people are and what they're doing. Because now that I have my independence, I'm like, okay, I can take care of myself because I'm not 8. But I do think a little bit of that enjoying knowing what's coming next really comes from what formed when I was 8 years old. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It made me a very organized person. But as an 8-year-old, that's not what's really expected of you. And so it was difficult being 8 and wanting something very different from what most of my other 8-year-old classmates wanted. And so that was a big change in my identity, was just kind of foundationally who I was. I became a worrier. I became a person who needed a super strict schedule. And that was just so totally different from how I was prior to the death. Because prior to the death, I was just a kid. And then I had this big thing happen that changed me. So
you really spoke to that so well. And I think that's just such an important place to kind of pause and just reiterate for people, for parents, for caregivers of children, is oftentimes children do have that, like an increase in their safety needs. So like a hyper focusing on safety. And a lot of times that comes from grief. And that goes back to something we talk about in this podcast all the time. Grief is so much more than sadness. It is definitely sadness, but for really people of all ages, that is a thing that changes, is this hyper focus on, okay, this person I love died. That means other people could die. Who's next? And it's kind of like people will say, I just don't want to be caught off guard next time.
Yeah.
And that also speaks to the suddenness. When a death is sudden, there's even more of a hyper focus on safety, because it is that anxiety that gets kicked in of, I want to be prepared. I want to know because I don't want to go through this again. And how can I try to protect people? Because maybe I wasn't able to protect this person. Those kind of thoughts play into that need for safety. And definitely, I've seen many children, very much the behaviors you were describing, like who's going to pick me up, what time, kids wanting watches so they could keep up with time.
Yeah, I got my first phone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then really like double checking, triple checking the plan, maybe before they get out of the car or leave the house to get on the bus for school, asking their teachers multiple times.
Yes.
Just so much hyper focused on that safety. And it's a need. It's a morning need that you had, which is the world is not safe.
Yes.
My dad was here and then he died. And I think especially when it's with sudden deaths.
Yeah. And I will say, I remember reading through what we were going to talk about, and something that was so helpful for me in that time, I was in the 3rd grade when he passed away, and it felt very inconvenient for everyone around me that I all of a sudden needed all that information, because I'd be at a friend's house and I'd be like, when is my mom getting me? Like, how do you know that? Has she called you? Have you heard from her? And that was kind of a nuisance to the parents and adults that I was around. And I felt like I was bothering people. And it was the same at school. I was very nervous to be there, but I had the best possible teacher I could have had in the 3rd grade. And I remember how valuable it was for me that the woman I spent the vast majority of my day with was so kind and accepting of the fact that I had left for Christmas break and come back completely different than the student that she knew before Christmas break after my dad died. And she had been teaching for a very long time, so I'm sure that her vast amounts of experience were very helpful in this. But I would sit in the back and I would worry and I would hold my rock and I would have my worry dolls, and it was just very different from before break. And she never made it a big point in front of the class. It was never like, Kate, get back to your work. It was never calling me out in front of the class, because that would have honestly just made it worse.
Or just telling you to stop it.
Right. Or if I asked questions, she would never be like, she would never brush it off. She would never ask me to stop asking questions. She was very graceful with the fact that what I was going through was super new for me as an 8-year-old. I had never lost anyone. And so I had no idea how to handle myself. And instead of calling me out for that or punishing that as bad behavior, she treated that as, this is not something you can help. And she would let me sit there and hold my rock and mess with my worry dolls. And I would do my work, but I had things on my desk and other kids did not. And she never made a big deal about that. And sometimes when we had free work time to read, she knew that was a time that was very easy for me to start thinking about, where's my mom? Did she make it to work? Is she going to pick me up? All of that would sort of flood in during free time. And so she would let me color instead of reading. And that was so good for me that she was able to quietly adapt to what I needed. And that was probably the only reason why I was able to finish out the 3rd grade basically on the normal schedule after my dad died, because of the slight accommodations that were made for how different I was as a student compared to everyone else. And that's something that I'll be grateful for forever. And so it was a huge help.
I am so grateful you had her. Especially part of the work that we do is working to educate educators about grief. And so many of the things you said she did were things that we try to help teachers know and understand. And so I'm so glad you had her. You mentioned earlier, you said these behaviors have not become crippling to you as an adult. And I love how you said that, because a lot of times that's what adults worry, like this is going to become crippling. This is going to change them forever. And definitely it changed you forever. These are behaviors that probably might not have escalated like this. You probably had some of it just naturally, but certainly the escalation did come from the grief. But it's not crippling.
No.
And in fact, you're a very organized person. So on one hand, you can say, I was able to take some of this, and there's some strengths in it that I have been able to use in my life.
Yes.
But also, I like how you described yourself as that 8-year-old before Christmas break and after. Very different, forever changed. And that people could see that. And thank goodness you had some people around you who were able to embrace that. But also, I think it's very important when you said being an 8-year-old, you knew also that it was kind of being annoying to some people. That's a secondary kind of feeling that you were getting of, I'm already unsettled, I'm already unsafe, and now I know that I'm bothering you?
Yeah. I was in a new home. We lived with some friends for a while because my mom had found my dad in our house. And so that was super difficult for her. And so I completely understand why we moved. But I was just completely in over my head because I had lost one of my two parents who I had grown up with. And then I was in an entirely new house with entirely new people that I really did not know that well. Mm-hmm. And so that was all a big change for me. And so I was around a lot of adults that were not my parent. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't feel like they owed me taking care of me. And I felt very worried about inconveniencing the people around me with, I knew my needs were greater than they had been before, to ask questions about my safety, mm-hmm. to know what was going on. Like I said, a typical 8-year-old probably is not going to hound someone when dinner is and what dinner's going to be. But in order to feel like I had control over mm-hmm. my situation that I had really lost before, mm-hmm. I needed to know, were we having fish or were we having steak? Mm-hmm. What time? 7 or 7:30? To me, it really mattered, even though that's not something that you would typically desperately need to know about. For me, that felt very secure, knowing exactly when and what was happening. And I could tell that it was bothersome, and I felt bad that mm-hmm. I was bothering people, but I just couldn't seem to stop myself mm-hmm. because I really could not be okay unless I knew what was going on.
Because you needed the safety.
Yes.
You needed to know, because everything changed, everything. And we say that, and people say that, but what people really need to understand is the level of safety in this world, because your mom found your dad in your home and he had died. Let's talk about your dad a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you want people to know about your dad?
You'll have to excuse me. I might get teary, but he was great. My little brother does not remember a lot about him because he died when my brother was 5. He had just turned 5. But I do remember some things, not everything, because I was 8, mm-hmm. and also because losing someone kind of puts the time in sort of this hazy cloud. But he loved music, and he loved a good cheeseburger. Mm-hmm. He loved the Doobie Brothers, and his favorite song was Can't You See? And I still listen to his music. I listened to it on the way here today. And he was just a nice person. Everyone I meet talks about how lovely he was, and I would have loved to have gotten to know him better. It's unfortunate that he died when he did. And I think that I really miss that I did not get more time with him, like anyone would. And something that kind of continues on today in knowing him is that I think about him on a regular basis. And it's still one of those things where it's been 12 years and I'm in college now. And I knew when I was little, even when I was 8, when he died, something I thought about was, he's not going to walk me down the aisle. That's something that a dad does for some people. And that, even as an 8-year-old, I knew that that was going to be something that was upsetting for me. But being in college, there's so many things that have come up throughout my life. And the school that I grew up going to did a lovely job with it, where the father-daughter dance turned into the family dance. Mm-hmm. And that was so great because it didn't make me feel like the odd one out.
Right.
And it's continued on that way.
Perfect.
But in the lower school, in high school, there was a father-daughter dance. And I had some lovely other father figures step in and go with me. But something I didn't realize I would miss him at is moving me into my college dorm. Mm-hmm. Or I'm in a sorority now. Sorority Dad's Day.
Yeah.
All of that has come up and has made me think about how much he would have enjoyed being there, because he was so friendly mm-hmm. and he loved people so much. And I think he would have loved the chance to get to meet all of the people that I know now. And it's really hard to think about the fact that he won't ever know my best friends. He won't ever know the person I'm going to marry. And it's just difficult that somebody who was so loved by everyone around me, because they do talk about him all the time. And I love that my family has not filed him away in a box. It's been over 10 years and they still talk about how nice he was and how much everyone loved him and how great he was at tennis and how much he loved to fish and golf. And we hear all these things about him. And I love hearing those things about him. And it feels like I get a chance to know him a little bit better every time somebody shares something with me. And I love that. That's so nice to get to hear from people who had more time with him than I did. But it's very difficult experiencing things that I feel like I know he would have enjoyed to be there for, or hearing a song I think he would have liked to hear, because I did get to know him in the 8 years he was my dad on this earth. And so it's hard knowing him and then experiencing things I know he would like to be here for and knowing that he's not. And that's really difficult because I feel like as I've gotten older, I've gained a clearer picture of who he is because, like I said, my grandparents talk about him. My mom talks about him. I've met some of his friends from high school. Like, everyone I meet has lovely things to say about him. And it's difficult because I hear these things and I'm like, I never got to play golf with you. And now I love golf. I would have loved to have gotten to do that. And so I love to hear these things about him and learn more about him. But it's really hard finding out new things and knowing that I never got to experience those things myself. So he was a great guy. He loved a lot of really great things. And I think that him loving to golf has made me love to golf, because when I found that out and I was on the middle school golf team and I hated the middle school golf team, I hated carrying my bag. I hated it because I was bad at it. And then I found out my dad loved golf and I was like, oh, maybe this isn't so bad. And fishing. Dead fish are kind of gross. Now I love to go fishing because I know that when I go places that are cool to fish, that it's something my dad would have enjoyed being there for. And so knowing things about him has really continued to shape my life and things that I enjoy, even though I might not have gotten to do those things with him while he was alive. So
feeling a connection to him in those spaces, even if it's a space maybe he's never been, but it was an activity that you know he enjoyed and potentially a space that he would have enjoyed.
Yes. And so I didn't personally get to know very much about him because I didn't have a very long time with him on earth, and he struggled a little bit at the end with his mental health. And so the person that I knew when he passed away was really not who he was as a person. It was just not being properly medicated and not taking good care of himself. And so I was left with a not so great picture of him as an 8-year-old, which for a long time was really difficult for me because there was such a contrast between the person who was my dad and who raised me and the person who I saw in the months leading up to his death. And so since his passing, finding out all of these things about him when he was doing well mentally, about how lovely he was and all of his interests and the music he liked and the food he liked to eat, has really helped me kind of shape a fuller picture of him prior to being him with his untreated mental illness. And so it's been lovely getting to know who he actually was as a person compared to the person that I knew in the last few months before he passed away.
Yes, absolutely. Like how you said that, the full picture of who he was. And so he struggled with mental health.
Yes, he did. It's always been a little unclear to me what exactly the issue was. I believe it was in the camp of bipolar disorder. And we've talked about this before, but we were not told about that as kids. It was kept from us, and I understand why, because they were worried about upsetting us, but we knew something was wrong, or at least I did. I knew there were fights going on. I heard them. The walls are not that thick. And so prior to his death, I knew something was not right in our house compared to the way our house normally was. Something was wrong. And so then when he passed away, I was told that it was from taking the wrong medication. Not intentionally, just like he took the wrong medicine and he died. And as an 8-year-old, I took that story. That I was like, okay, that makes sense. And that was what people at my school were told as well. But their parents knew the truth. He had committed, or I guess completed suicide. And so throughout the years, I kind of began to doubt the story I had been told. It just didn't really add up to me. As I got older and I learned more about the ways people die and what death looked like, I sort of asked myself, most grown-ups know not to just take a medicine that's going to kill them. Like, that is not a thing that happens often and on accident.
Right.
And so then I kind of began to wonder, that might not have been what happened. And I'd also kind of always picked up from some of my friends that maybe I hadn't been told the full truth, because a lot of kids had been told the truth by their parents who knew. And so I was around people who knew, and I didn't know. And eventually I put the pieces together myself, and I asked, and I said, how did Dad really die? Because what you guys told me isn't true. I knew at that point that the story I had been told was not the truth, but I didn't know what had happened. And at that point, I was told that he had committed suicide. I was 12. And it was super difficult for me. I wasn't really sad. I was mainly just angry, because I felt very frustrated that other people who were not in our family, who were kids my age, knew the truth about my own dad before I did. And that was really hard for me, because I was like, what the heck? Like, why am I the last person to know about what happened to my own dad? And I get that my mom was worried. You don't want to talk about what suicide is with an 8-year-old. Right. That's really difficult.
Yeah.
And a hard thing to explain why someone would do that. But looking back at it, and I've talked about this with my mom, I would have so much rather known, because when I found out what had actually happened, I basically had to re-grieve losing my dad, because that was such a different story than the one I had been given at 8. And so knowing that he had made the choice to die because of his mental illness really shifted it from it was an accident to it was intentional. And that really gave me a lot of questions. And I felt a lot of guilt that I hadn't gotten to process when the death happened. And it was hard finding out the truth 4 years later, because you sort of passed your grief grace period, which shouldn't be a thing. Right. You should be able to grieve whenever you want. But grief is kind of looked at as an inconvenience by most people who are not actively grieving. It's like, okay, stop crying. That's annoying. And so when I was 12, and he had died 4 years ago, it didn't seem like it would be an appropriate time to all of a sudden be super sad about the death again and super angry and asking a lot of questions, because that's old news basically to everyone else. Yeah. And so I didn't really get the chance to ever fully process that like I should have, because I wasn't told when the death happened.
Right. We see that for sure. And I think this is such an important topic, and I so appreciate your willingness to share, because you know, even just yesterday, I had 2 conversations with counselors. One was with a counselor, one was with a family, of telling the children the truth. And it's painful. Nobody wants to have these conversations. I wish to goodness no families had to, but that's not the reality. And we know we need to. And, you know, we talk about how to tell children in age-appropriate ways, in small doses. They don't have to know every detail and every fact, but we do need to tell them the truth versus a made-up version, because kids, and I've never had a child in the 27 years I've been doing this not do what you just did, of putting the pieces together, thinking about it, like, well, that just doesn't make sense. I just don't think my dad would do that. I mean, I've had kids say, my dad was very careful. He knew not to do, you know, whatever they had been told. And then also I just watched that it creates troubles with some families with continued trust. You know, I hear a lot of good health between you and your mom, that you all have had these conversations, y'all have been open. But a lot of times when kids do find out, which they do, older cousins are usually the ones that tell, or friends, because friends' parents will tell them and say, but don't tell them. That's never going to go well. The internet, all the ways, social media, people can find out. And if we can have that hard conversation in the beginning, we're setting up a relationship of trust.
Yeah.
And that's so important.
And I do think now my mom and I have had the chance to talk about it, but at the time I was very upset with her, and she just did what she thought was best. And so now it's not something I hold on to and
Right.
angry about forever. But when I was 12, it's already hard to be a 12-year-old. And so finding that out and being like, oh my gosh, you lied to me. That was really hard. And I was super upset about finding out the truth. And so I have told her, and not that we can go back in time, but I really would have rather known. And so if somebody has the opportunity to let their kid know the truth of what happened and give them the time near the death to process the truth of how the death happened, I think that that's so much more helpful than finding out years down the line and being like, is it okay for me to still be upset about this because I'm basically finding out he died all over again. And I would have so much rather have known closer to when he actually died.
And you said that so well about the re-grieving, and you absolutely did. You had to redo the narrative that you had created. You had to redo coping skills that you were using for the previous narrative. And you said that just perfectly, that you had to redo all that in a socially unacceptable, it's been 4 years, why are you grieving society? Because that's certainly the way our world looks at things. And so I imagine a lot of that then was done very privately.
Yes. And I do think that sometimes I still have moments where I still have a lot of questions about what happened and why it happened. And I don't think the only person who could really answer those are my dad, who is no longer with us. But it would have been a lot more appropriate while everyone else in my family was grieving for me to be able to work that out with them, because they all knew what had happened. They were grieving the loss of him as a death by suicide, and I was not. And so I also feel some sort of guilt about dredging up their own feelings about the past, because I don't want to be like, hey, let's relive this awful time because I'm just now finding out about it. And so had I gotten the chance to grieve it the way that they were all grieving it alongside with them, I think that that would have been so much healthier for me than having to just kind of have this cloud of unanswered questions about the truth of the death that I had not known before. If I could have just asked those questions when everyone else was also going through it, I think that would have just been a huge difference in my grief journey. And I'm fine, and I've had the chance to ask them, but it took time to work up to asking them. It took 4 years to figure out what had happened. And so I wish I would have gotten to do that when the death happened, as opposed to in bits and pieces throughout time, because that's kind of like mini little grief journeys spread throughout my life, instead of getting to have my like big moment when he actually passed away.
Within that supportive network that was also
Yes. And then
grieving.
Surrounding the death, that's when a lot of the memorialization is happening, and everyone from his life came in town for the funeral and the wake and was in our house. And so we were with all these people who knew him and knew how he died, and they were all there to talk about it and talk about him. And since I didn't know the truth, I was very sheltered from everything that was going on. I attended the memorial service and I was around the people in my house, but they knew I didn't know. So it was very hush hush. And so I didn't get the chance to be fully involved in the grieving process that was going on within my community, because they knew I didn't know the truth. And so I was kind of put on the outer edge of that to keep me from finding out the truth, which was thought to be the safest and best option for me. But looking back at it, I really do wish I had gotten to be in it with everyone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So you're becoming a counselor.
That's the goal.
Talk to us about that road.
So I've had 4 majors at college. I think everybody has their moment. But I found child and family studies, and I really loved it. And I loved learning about, they always joke that people who become counselors are people who want to work through something that they have going on their own. And I think that might be the truth a little bit. But in a way, I think that's a good thing, because something I've found is that having lost my dad, the joke about me being a 40-year-old in an 8-year-old's body has continued on into college. And I find that when bad things happen, I tend to handle them a little bit more responsibly, because I've seen something bad happen in my own life. And so it's not a, oh my God, what are we going to do moment? It's like, okay, here's how we're going to handle this logically. And so finding child and family studies and getting the educational background on how families work and how children should developmentally be raised in an appropriate way to keep them on track and healthy, and how families work and how families communicate and their boundaries really made me super interested in the scientific and research-based side of what goes into counseling and why y'all give the advice that you do. And so then I thought, well, I've always loved getting to go to therapy, and it has been so incredibly helpful for me. And I think that having lost my dad has given me this unique sense of empathy for how hard it is to be going through such a difficult situation when it feels like everyone else is just leaving you behind in the dust and moving on. And they're like, okay, that happened a whole 5 days ago. Right. Let's get past that. That's so hard when you're like, I am so not ready to move from where I am. Everyone else is leaving me behind. And a counselor is a person who sits there with you and talks about why you're not ready to keep going, instead of also leaving you behind in the dust. And so getting to be somebody who sits with people through some of their toughest moments, and it's just like, I'm ready to start going when you are, or we can just sit here and talk about it, is something that is so valuable. And I would love to be able to do that for people. And I think that because I understand how hard it can be to move forward, and that it's okay to take time to stay in what you're feeling and process it, that I want to go into the counseling field and provide that space for other people, because it was so valuable for me to have.
Excellent. And you're right. They do say that about us when we're all in those graduate programs. And I think most of the people who are there to do their own work get weeded out. So that's good. But usually people are drawn to these fields because of maybe experiences in their own life. And you said that you have learned through your grief, which we hear this from so many people, a deeper sense of empathy. And we certainly need good mental health providers with empathy. Obviously clinical skills, but empathy can't be taught. And so that's so important. So you're in college, you're finishing up, you're thinking about graduate school. So it was time for an internship, and you are here at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief for just a little bit longer, doing your internship with us. What has that been like, kind of on the other side of this grief center, not being the client, not being the camper, but being the intern?
It has been really, really lovely. My grandmother is a very spiritual person who believes in a lot of like the full circle moments in life and how nice it is to have a really nice, complete journey places. And so as part of my major, I'm required to complete an internship this summer. And most of the other people in my major will work in hospitals. That's not where I'm headed. I'm planning on going into counseling. And so I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm not qualified to be providing counseling services, and I'm not in graduate school, so I'm not completing an official practicum. And so I said, where is somewhere that I know that they would be happy that I'm excited about going into the counseling field, and like, come let me learn as much as I can without being in graduate school. And I had to rack my brain for a minute, because I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And then I had this moment where I was like, I wonder if I could go back to the Kimmons Wilson Center in Memphis. And so I emailed you, and I remember saying, do you remember me? Because it's been a long time. And I was like, I want to be a counselor, and I was wondering if you would let me be an intern there. And so you said yes. Of course, I remember you. And I remember getting your email and being like, oh, thank goodness. And so
always cracks me up when I get these emails. Do you remember me? I'm like, of course I remember you. And it's just so funny because I think that just says so much about our staff and our team and how important our kids are to us.
I remembered who my counselor was. She's since moved, and one of the other counselors remembered being my brother's counselor. And I was like, wow, this is just so lovely. But I came back because I feel like I knew that y'all do such important work providing free counseling to people who the last thing they need is the stress of finding a therapist to deal with their loss that takes their insurance and has availability and is going to call them back and actually get them on the schedule in an appropriate amount of time. And so I was like, I knew how well run it was because I will be so honest, you astound me with the way that you are able to get so much done during the day. And so I knew that coming to learn from y'all was going to be super impactful because Good Grief is an institution. It has been around for almost 30 years and it has been well run for the whole time it's been around. And so I wanted to not only see what it was like to be a counselor, but also what it's like to work in an organization that is a well-run counseling organization. And since I've been a client and seen how well-run it is, I knew that coming to work for y'all would teach me what working in an organized and efficient counseling group looks like. And so I decided I wanted to come back and intern and spend some time observing sessions and also learning about the administration side. So sitting in on intake has been super cool for me to see the process that y'all do to make sure that everyone who needs to be seen can get seen. And so for me, it's been really nice professionally because it's really served its purpose as an internship, but not everyone listening is going to be a counselor. So personally, what it has served for me as is honestly, it's been kind of a chance to go back to being a camper and being a client, because when I was a client, like we've talked about, I didn't have the full picture. I didn't really know exactly what had happened in my loss. And so since finding out that, I haven't been back as a client or just in general. And so what was really profound for me, and being at the center was interesting, walking in for the first time and seeing the waiting room where I sat as a kid and walking past the tree that I would hit with a pool noodle was very interesting, being like, oh, yeah, I have been here before and in a very different time in my life and as a different role. But the big thing that was the most full circle moment for me, what really I felt like brought it all back together, was when we were at camp and we did the balloon release service. Steve, who does pastoral care, a lovely man, he had an extra balloon. And I took it and I walked out into the field by myself and I released a balloon for my dad. And I hadn't gotten to do that knowing what I know now at 8. And so it was so nice to get to come back and let go of another balloon for him, knowing the full truth of what happened and having spent 12 years grieving the loss of him. It was nice to get to do that again, being where I am now, and get to be like, I'm here, you're up there, wherever that is. Hey, hope you got the last balloon. And it was just nice to get to let go of one again, being where I am today, as opposed to where I was when I was 8.
Yeah. Grief doesn't end.
No, never.
It changes shape and form, but it doesn't end. And I love that image of you, 8-year-old you or 9-year-old you, releasing your balloon at camp, and then you now in that same moment. And that takes me to, I think, what do you think? Because I feel certain we will be wanting many of our parents, grandparents, guardians to listen to this, because we talk to them. We try to provide so much education, so much support, but hearing these things from you is going to be very important to many of these families, especially families that need to have hard conversations, real hard conversations. What do you want parents and grandparents and guardians to know about these hard conversations and just grieving children in general? What do you think they should know?
So I'd also thought about this before I came in. There's 3 things really that I think are important. First off, telling them the truth is really an invaluable thing you can do for them, because giving them the space, like I said earlier, to get to grieve at the same time that everyone else is grieving that loss and the truth of what the loss was is super important. And I wish I had gotten that. And if you have the chance to do that and you can bring yourself to, you should. Mm-hmm. Second, if there's conflict going on in the family, because losing someone is hard for everyone, if there's conflict about what the funeral is going to look like, or seeing the kids, or anything involving really anything around the death, it's not the children's place to solve that conflict for you. And it's not their place to pick a side. They've already lost a parent, and they do not need the additional stress of knowing the grown-ups in their life are mad at each other. And so it's okay to talk about being sad about the loss and being mad about the loss, but it doesn't need to be, well, your mom said this and your grandma said this and who's right, because they're kids. They don't want to pick between mom and grandma. They don't know who's right. They just want to be sad that they lost someone. And so don't bring them into the conflict, but it's totally fine to talk about. I don't want to say don't bring them into the conflict and leave the impression of don't talk about your feelings.
Right.
Sharing your feelings about the loss is super important, and letting them know that it's also sad for you or upsetting for you. Mm-hmm. That's great. But if there's anger between living members of the family, it's not the place of the kid to resolve that anger or even really know about it.
Right.
And then finally, the thing that was most important for me, and that I really hope everyone who loses someone has, kids and adults, is the space to be sad or to grieve their loss. Because you can be, we say sad, mad, glad at the camp song. Mm-hmm. But however you're feeling, it's so relieving to know that having your feelings isn't inconveniencing people around you. And so creating the space for somebody to cry and not be like, okay, get over it now, or be worried. Stop asking so many questions, or be angry. Oh my gosh, your anger is scaring me. Letting people feel what they want to feel, and a kid feel what they want to feel, even though it's hard to see a sad or angry kid, because kids are usually super excited to be here. It feels a little strange to see your kid be really sad about something. But you need that time to be sad and to be mad. And the most valuable thing for me was the people around me who were okay with me being sad and angry and confused and needing some time to just deal with what had happened to me. And so giving your children the space to feel the feelings you might not normally see from them is such an important thing when they're dealing with the loss of someone in their family. For me, the person around me who was the most impactful was one of my friends. It felt like all the other kids I remember when my dad died. Our house was full of all these people I had never met before. I was like, where did you come from? And you're eating all my food, and you're playing with my games, and everyone is so happy, and this is terrible. And I had a friend, and she wasn't even someone I knew super well. It was one of my mom's friend's kids. And she sat in my room with me, and we sat in silence, and I cried, and she played on her mini iPad, and she did not say a word. And it was so, and I still think about her. I texted her the other day when I was thinking about being on this podcast to let her know how much I appreciated that. Her just sitting there and letting me be sad and not asking me to get up and go play a game or stop crying because it was upsetting. Just sitting there while I cried, doing her own thing. She wasn't sad, and that's okay. But just letting me be upset and just sitting with me was something that sticks with me at 21, even though I was 8 when that happened. And so giving whoever you are, when you're around a grieving person, just letting them sit there and feel whatever they need to feel. You don't have to feel the same thing as them, but just let them feel the way they want to feel is so important, and honestly the best thing you could possibly do. So
absolutely, the power of presence.
Yes.
I always say zip your lips and just be.
Yes.
Yeah.
I took a class my senior year of high school at St. Mary's. It's called The Meaning of Life. And it's a great thing that I think is pretty unique to St. Mary's. And it was taught by my teacher, Miss Ray. And she's lovely. And she's written a lot of lovely books. And that class, we read a lot of poetry and writings. And we read a lot about loss and when bad things happen. And we read about being down in a hole, because that's kind of what grief feels like, is you're down in this hole and there's no rope and there's no ladder and you're in it alone and it's dark and dirty and scary. And she talked about the importance of people who are willing to come and sit in the hole with you, because you'll get yourself out eventually if you want to, and you will. You'll climb up or you'll find a ladder or something will happen that gets you out of the hole. But until you're ready to leave it, you got to sit down there and just be in the hole. And the people who are the most important in life are the people who come down into it with you, not the people who try to pull you out before you're ready.
That's right.
And so everybody needs their time down in the hole, grief. And so just letting people around you who have experienced a loss do that. And then when they feel ready, they'll leave. And so being the person who gets down there with them is just something that is so important and will stick with them.
Yeah, it's
forever.
the memorable one. Like you said, this
Yes.
many years later, that's what you remember.
Yes.
And how powerful that is. I think I have two final questions, and they're both, I don't know, they're kind of different. This is a question that I know, sitting across from many parents and grandparents and guardians, they will say, will my child ever be happy again? Now, I use the word joy, having known so much loss myself. I look at joy. I love joy. So I'm going to ask you, do you feel happiness and joy in your
Yes.
life now?
I do. I think that, like you said, your grief never goes away, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. I love getting to tell my friends about my dad. I still talk about him. Songs come on that he listened to. They love the Doobie Brothers at places that serve hamburgers. You are there and
Yes.
you cannot get away from them, or Jimmy Buffett. And one of those songs will come on and I'll say, and it's a happy moment to get to say, my dad loved this song. Or to do something that my dad would like and be like, my dad would have really liked this. And they don't think it's sad. They like to hear about him because they never got to know him. And so it's sad and happy, but I am happy. And I would say I'm mainly happy. There's just a little bit of sad about that and other things that have happened weaved into my life. And that's how it is for everyone. And that's okay. But overall, I am an incredibly happy person. I love my life at Baylor. I have loved college. It has been so great for me getting to be in a new state and meet entirely new people and just be, my mom calls it a half-baked grown-up. I'm like, brownie's not ready to come out of the oven yet. And that's kind of what college has been. And it's just so fun. And I have a great time. And I love my life. I love everything I do. I love all the walks I go on. I love to cook. I love to paint. And painting is something I picked up when I was a kid, when I was grieving, and has carried on throughout high school and college for me. And it's something I love to do. And I have hobbies and I have goals and I have dreams. I want a dog. I want a front porch. I want a master's degree and no massive student debt. And so I'm super happy, and I still grieve the loss of my dad, but that doesn't make me a sad person.
Yes. Yes. I've told so many families that, but hearing that from you is what they need.
Yeah.
8-year-old Kate, 12-year-old Kate. Do you know how proud they are?
I think that they would be super happy to see that I've gotten a lot of my questions answered and that I am okay, because I didn't feel okay then And I didn't really feel like I was going to be okay. Because I was like, when am I not going to be so sad and so confused? And it didn't feel like there was a light at the end of that tunnel, because 12-year-olds tend to be a little bit dramatic. But I am okay. And there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and I had reached it, and it's great at the end of the tunnel. And I think they would be proud. I think they would just be relieved that I got to where I am today. And if I could go back and tell my 12-year-old self, you are going to end up in a place that you love, with friends that you love, and doing things that you love, I probably would not believe myself, but I did make it here, and I'm doing great.
Yeah. I think they must be very proud of you. I feel certain your mom and your grandmother are. I know that I am. Your counselor, who has moved away, but I have talked to her. We're all proud of you. And you have worked so hard on your grief. And we know through this podcast, when we say that, you have mourned well. Not period into the sentence, comma, continues to mourn well. Even like you said, walking out into that field at camp and having that moment in time for you, or having a hamburger and hearing a song and sharing with your friends. That's how we know, you say, kind of reach that place. We know you're mourning well because you're continuing to mourn well. You're continuing those bonds. You are living with your grief. And that's when we see healing and meaning happen. So thank you so much for being here and sharing this with us today. I think this podcast is going to be so meaningful to so many families. Thank you.
Of course.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.